Hi, everyone, and welcome to Unit 1 PowerPoint about sources of law. At this point, you obviously have found Unit 1 of the class, and you are also supposed to read Chapter 1 of your textbook for this week. And don't forget to also participate in the discussion board and complete the homework assignment. So my purpose of doing these PowerPoints is to talk to you as if I was in class, just to highlight some of the important concepts that are covered in your textbook. It's really not my job to just repeat what's in the textbook because you can read that on your own time. But there are some really important points that I want to make sure we discuss, and this is my way of discussing them. And then I will have this opportunity to talk to you. And then on the discussion board, we can have a discussion back and forth about some of these concepts. So as you can see, if you haven't looked already, in Unit 1 discussion board, one of the first questions I ask you all is, what topics do you think we'll cover in a class called business law? And I will have an opportunity to read those topics and go over them with you. But it's also really important before we get into all those particular topics like torts or how contracts are made or intellectual property, how businesses are created. It's really important for us to talk about where our laws come from and not just talk about what the laws are. And there's a few reasons for that. Number one, it's important for us to know in case we ever want to make a change to the laws. I'm sure a lot of us have complained from time to time that we don't like some laws. So if we ever want them to be changed, we should know how they're made and where they come from. It's also important because when you are operating your own business or going to work every day, even driving your car, the laws impact us. And without knowing where they're coming from, it's hard to give that some context. So this is just a little bit of highlighting some of the key points that you'll see in Chapter 1 and our first unit. First, I want to mention the Constitution. Hopefully, you've all heard of the Constitution. And why do I bring it up here? Because the Constitution is the document that gives us a framework for how our government works. So in order to figure out where our laws come from, we have to talk about how the government is allowed to make those laws. So you can think of the Constitution as that framework of how we make laws. And here I'll reference, a little bit of American history, thinking about the founding fathers coming together and saying to themselves, we're creating a new country. And this new country is going to have an opportunity to make laws. But how are we going to do that? What rules are we going to follow when we make those laws? And that's really what the Constitution is. So the Constitution set up how our government operates. And there's a couple of key points I want to make in the Constitution, from the Constitution, that really we will carry through all semester. One of them is a concept called federalism, and the other is the balance of powers. So a little bit about federalism. If you remember how the country was founded, you can think back to those original 13 colonies who wanted their freedom from the King of England. They wanted the ability to govern themselves. They didn't want to be governed by a king, and they certainly didn't want to be governed by a king that was across the Atlantic Ocean. So the 13 colonies we know went to Revolutionary War and they won, and they said, okay, now it's time to make our new government. So how do we do that? And there really was a conflict. One of the original conflicts that we can actually still see today in how our laws operate is whether we're going to have this big national, what we also call federal government, but we also have individual state governments. So that was the colonist way of balancing who has the power to govern, who has the powers to make laws. That was really important to the colonists. So the colonists said, okay, let's have both. Let's have what we call the national government. Another word for that is federal. And so that's the government that's based in Washington, D.C. And when the federal government passes laws, it applies to all of us in the entire country. But it's still important that each state keeps its own identity. And we all know that states can pass their own laws that are different from state to state. Even take something as simple as the driving age and when you could obtain and how you obtain your driver's license differs in different states. So the colonists said, let's have both. Let's have this national government that we're going to call the federal government, and we're going to each have our own individual state governments. Why is this important to us in business law? Because when we operate our businesses, when we go about our daily business, we in Massachusetts, we have to follow federal, national laws, but we also have to follow the laws of Massachusetts. And what if we want to open a location in New Hampshire? We have to follow New Hampshire laws as well. It makes the study of law both exciting and complicated because it means we have 51 sources of law at all times, right? 50 states, 50 state governments, and the federal government. As we talk about different laws throughout this class, we will make reference to which of those laws are national, federal laws, and which ones are state laws. Of course, we'll focus a little bit more heavily on Massachusetts law, but we will reference other state laws as well throughout the semester. So just a little bit more about federalism, because I think you even see it in the news today, that there is a constant push over who should have control or power over what. The Constitution said, yes, we have federal national government and we have state government, but which one gets to control if there's a conflict? So in the Constitution is a clause called the Supremacy Clause, which boils down to say when there's a conflict between federal and state law, federal law is supreme. Federal law is considered the law of the land, not the individual states. That doesn't mean states don't have a lot of power. In fact, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution specifically confers to the states all the powers that are not for the federal government. So states still have an awful lot of power. But as I said, there's a constant push and pull over which government entity should regulate. And we even see that today. So that's theme number one, is the idea of federalism, that we are governed by both federal laws and state laws. The other important theme that came out of the Constitution is this balance of power. Remember, I was talking about how the colonists were worried about a king overtaking, controlling too much, vesting too much power in one person. Well, an important theme of the Constitution was to say, let's have a balance of that power. So there's no one branch of government or no one person who has control over everything. And we actually see that a lot throughout the administration of President Trump, is various challenges to his powers in the executive branch. So there are the branches of government. Hopefully this is not the first time you've heard of them. The Constitution gives us an executive branch, a judicial branch, and a legislative branch. I'll briefly mention them here, but in the next 2 weeks, we'll go over them a little bit more in depth, because I do want you to know how the legislative branch makes laws and also how the court system, which is the judicial branch, interprets those laws. And in doing that, we're actually going to have the opportunity to read court decisions as part of this class too, and understand how courts make laws. So the legislative branch, now remember, before I say something, that we have the federal system. So when we talk about the legislative branch, we actually have a legislative branch at the federal level and a legislative branch at every single state level. So at the federal level, we call the legislative branch U.S. Congress. Each state also has its own legislature. Perhaps you've been to the State House in Boston. That is our state legislature. And then both legislatives, whether you're talking about the federal or the state, pass laws that we call statutes. Notice the word doesn't say statue, like the Statue of Liberty. It says statutes. So again, in the next couple of units, we'll talk a little bit more about how that process works. But the legislative branch is the branch that actually drafts the laws. The judicial branch is made up of the court systems. And again, we have both federal and state courts. And if you drive around Massachusetts or wherever you are in the United States, if you're not here, if you're in another state listening to this, you will see various courthouses. And some of those courthouses are federal and some are state. And these are the branches, this is the branch, that interprets the laws and resolve conflicts between parties. So we'll talk a lot about how the judicial branch makes law. And in doing so, as I mentioned, we'll also have the opportunity to read court decisions both next week or the week after, and then also throughout the class. The last branch of government is the executive branch. This is the President of the United States, and at each state level, it also includes each governor. And so there's your executive branch. And then I do want to mention one other branch of government that is not mentioned in the Constitution. It's not really its own branch of government, but it is a huge source of laws that we follow and use every day. In fact, I would say this not branch is what governs us even more. And those are administrative agency laws. So we'll also talk a little bit about where administrative agency law comes from, but here are just some examples of administrative agencies: the Registry of Motor Vehicles, the Food and Drug Administration, the IRS, the Department of Education, the State Department. All of these administrative agencies also make a lot of law that impact us. And it's not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution, which makes it even more interesting. So in our next unit, I'll give you a little background about where administrative agency law comes from as well. All of this is to say that we have a lot of law in the United States. There's no way in 15 weeks we can cover all these laws on both the federal and state level. But as we move through each section, we will talk about whether this is a federal law, whether it's a state law, and how it impacts us. The last really important piece I want to make reference to in this initial PowerPoint, and this is also covered in your book, is the difference between civil law and criminal law. In the United States, we have a breakdown of both civil and criminal law. The really easy way to remember this is that the criminal law involve crimes like burglary, arson, robbery, breaking and entering, rape. And when we talk about criminal law, we're talking about all those crimes. Every law in the United States that's not criminal law is referred to as civil law. So that would include a whole bunch of topics we're covering this semester: the law of corporations, the law of torts and contracts, employment law, agency law, property law. These are all areas of civil law. Even topics we won't cover this semester, like family law or the law of wills and writing your will, that's all considered civil law. So we have a body of law that's criminal law and a body of law that's civil law. In this class, we are really going to focus just on civil law. But I wanted you to go over some of these important differences and start becoming familiar with the vocabulary. In a civil case, we always talk about a case involving a plaintiff versus a defendant. A plaintiff is a private person like me. A really great example would be, and this is not true, just hypothetically, if I got fired from my job at Middlesex Community College and I wanted to sue them for employment discrimination, I sue Middlesex Community College. I'm the plaintiff, Middlesex is the defendant. In a criminal case, the matter is always brought by the government. It's always the state of Massachusetts versus the criminal defendant, or the US government versus the defendant. Obviously, another key difference between criminal and civil is what the result is. Criminal cases, which we decide at this very high standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, the defendant can lose his liberty. He can go to prison or jail for losing a criminal case. In a civil case, no matter how badly you act, you're never going to go to jail for a civil case. The worst punishment a civil defendant can experience is money damages, is paying money to the plaintiff for her injuries, even a slip and fall injury or medical bills or damages for violating employment discrimination laws. So this is just a little bit of introduction of some of the differences between civil and criminal. I want to mention one other important difference that comes up a lot. The word guilty is only used in the context of criminal law. A defendant in criminal law is guilty. A defendant in civil law is liable. So we also talk a lot about civil liabilities, meaning when is a business liable to a customer or an employee. So get used to that word liable for a defendant being responsible, not guilty. All right, that's the end of our first PowerPoint. I look forward to having discussions with you guys on the discussion board about these topics and more.